Hey everyone, this is Christian Heimel, host of Press Row. Thanks so much for listening to the following broadcast, courtesy of Public House Media.
Hi, this is Emily.
This is Lindsay.
And this is Elizabeth,
co-hosts of Beauties and Headcanons here on Public House Media. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Once you are done with this episode, we hope you'll come check out our show, Beauties and Headcanons, where we talk nerdy to you about fandoms, fan fiction, and all pop culture for nerds that you can think of. A new show comes out every Friday.
Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes so you never miss an episode of Beauties and Headcanons. Thanks again for checking out the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Welcome to How to Write Good. My name is Daniel Poppy. I am your host. Follow me at danielpoppy.com. This podcast is brought to you by Public House Media. If you want a chance to win a hard copy of my book, because we have ebooks now, so I could say win a copy of my book and you just get an ebook. If you want a chance to do that, you can go to my website and you can look on the side. It says, do you want to follow me or something like that. So there's one for the blog, that's different, and then there's one for my newsletter. And if you want, I won't be sending out tons and tons of things, but the things that I am sending out to you, I hope will be beneficial to you. That is the point of it. And I will be giving away at least one free hard copy of my book to one of the first 100 people who sign up. So it could be you, all right? Or maybe more. I might be giving away more than that. We'll see. Today is the last Wednesday of the month, so I have a guest this week. I'd like to introduce you to my guest, Emily Brady. She actually has a podcast called Plot Boilers. Plot Boilers, not pot boilers, Plot Boilers. You can find Plot Boilers on iTunes and on plotboilers.com. You can also follow Plot Boilers at Plot Boilers on Twitter. And Emily actually also recently narrated an audiobook called Happily by Chauncey Rogers. So that is available on Audible. Hello, Emily. Welcome on the show.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me.
So before we actually get into what we're talking about today, can you just tell us a little bit about your podcast and maybe a little bit about yourself as well?
Yeah, totally. So my podcast is basically a mixture. It kind of started out as book reviews and then also little tidbits on the writing life in general. So it's a funny mixture of me talking about books that I love and also what I love as far as storytelling is concerned. So it's kind of for people who like stories and also maybe creating their own. Okay.
And can you give us an example of something and how you'd go about talking about that on your podcast?
Yeah, most of the time it's kind of whatever piques my interest at the time, whatever I'm reading. There's no real specific pattern to the books I pick. It's just whatever's recommended. And then I like to look at them from the perspective of someone who just loves books and then someone who also likes to analyze things like story structure and character development and how different ideas are presented in literature, and then how that translates to someone who is also an aspiring writer.
Okay. All right. And can we hear a little bit about yourself as well and maybe how you got into this area? Well, besides the fact that you love books and you're an aspiring, I don't know, there's probably more to that.
Yeah, for sure. So I've always loved reading and I've always loved writing, but I didn't actually start pursuing creative writing in a serious capacity until college, really. I was a music major for a long time, and then I ended up switching to communications with an emphasis in print media, and it was like this whole new world of story structure exists. Like there's a way that people are wired to think about what we read, and we're wired to have certain expectations and whatnot. So that kind of just turned into this perfect storm where eventually I started the podcast because I love talking about those things with people, and there's a whole community of other people who share the same interests. So that's kind of my background. And as a writer, I would consider myself an amateur in the sense that I make less money doing it than I put out maintaining the craft. But I've worked professionally as a writer in a marketing capacity before, so it's not exactly the same thing as fiction writing, but I've done some work as a professional writer in the past, so it's kind of just always been part of my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think coming from a music major, I have a friend who's a music major, and I just think that with music, if you come from that perspective, there's so many rules to it, and it's kind of been the depths of music have been dredged. That's what he thinks, but well, not to a certain degree. It's like you have all these composers, but it's really organized. And then if you switch over to something else, it's like, okay, you want to see the organization with this, that. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, there's a huge connection between those two things. Yep.
Yeah, and well, I don't know. I'm of the opinion that there's kind of a huge connection between art in general, but that's a completely different discussion. So we won't even get on that. And I probably talk about it too much already.
That's a whole podcast in itself.
That's a whole podcast in itself, definitely. So we are actually going to be jumping into a few books, and I'm not going to take the credit for coming up with these books. Emily actually came up with these books, so I'm going to give her the credit because honestly, like I don't know. I think that you should know that she's the one that came up with these, and most of the stuff that is going to be talked about is probably going to be coming from her, because like she probably knows more about the books and is able to expound on like how they're written and everything like that. So Emily, if you don't mind, we can jump into the Count of Monte Cristo.
Yeah, totally. So The Count of Monte Cristo is one of those books that I feel like I should have read sooner, but I actually just read it for the first time last month. Mm-hmm. I think it was originally published in like 1844, or it was completed in 1844 or thereabouts. It's by Alexander Dumas, and it's basically a classic revenge story. Mm-hmm. So it's like that era's revenge story. I don't know. I feel like that's what it is. Yeah, totally.
Sorry, go on.
No, yeah, it's for sure. I think it's kind of like the first one that I'm aware of. So in my mind, I'm like, it's the original revenge story, or I've always thought of it that way, but just recently got around to reading it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I know it's been turned into like a lot of movies and stuff, which I have not seen. So I'm only speaking from experience as what I've read. But the basic premise is this guy gets thrown into prison because, and he's innocent. And while he's there, he comes into a large sum of money and then decides to escape and exact revenge on the people who have done him wrong. So it then spends approximately 1,200 pages going into this whole long, drawn-out plot that he has to get revenge on these other characters.
Yeah, I've actually read The Count of Monte Cristo, and what it kind of reminds me of, if you're into this, I know, so what it reminds me of to a certain degree, how it goes through the process of, this is a little bit of a side note, it goes through the process of him getting thrown in prison to revenge, kind of reminds me, like how slow it is, reminds me of Breaking Bad. Because it takes a really long time to get from, Can you see that? Like, it takes so long to get through, it's a big book. And it takes so long to get through that book, and it's like this, he's going to do this, and there's all this stuff going on. And then finally you get to the end where he actually gets his revenge. But one thing that I like, when I look at something written or something like that, I like to figure out like kind of what makes it tick. So for this book, what do you think like the core piece or pieces that make it stand out are?
I think there were two things. The first one is character development, and they're kind of intertwined, is his progression as a person, because at the beginning of the book, he's very pure and innocent, and he's about to get married, and he's just in love, and he just loves life and the world, and his job is going really well. And then by the end, or like halfway through, he's like, all I want to do is get revenge. So there's obviously a huge character arc happening. And within that, there are a lot of these themes, which would be the second thing that kind of popped out at me. But these whole themes of revenge, and at first, obviously, you're reading it because you want to side with the protagonist, but it gets to a certain point where you start wondering, is this actually the best course of action? Like, at what point is revenge not a good thing, or is it ever a good thing? So those two are the major themes that I noticed from it, and they're kind of, I guess, intertwined into one. But his character development is really what stuck out to me the most.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on that, because I read the book. It's been, I don't know how many years since I've read the book. It's been several years since I've read the book, but the thing that still sticks in my mind is the fact that like you start out, and then by the end of the book, you got a completely different character you're working with, which is really satisfying. Actually, it's kind of odd that it's that satisfying. I don't know. What do you what do you think about that? So we've got character development, the revenge, but in the end, like the revenge is what's pushing the character development, wouldn't you say? Or like that's kind of the, or would you disagree with that?
At the beginning, it's circumstantial because he gets thrown into prison and he's there for, I think, like 13 years or so. Yeah. And while he's there, he gets to this certain point where he decides he's just going to starve himself to death because he's over it. I doesn't even want to live anymore. Because up until that point, he had not that he had only experienced good things in life, but he had a very naive and innocent perspective of the world. So at first, the character development is circumstantial because he gets to this very dark place just by the fact that things have happened to him, and it makes him have a new perspective on life. And then after that, he takes that and then runs with it to an extreme level. I think it's right after he gets out of prison. There's this specific point where he is like, okay, I'm done helping people. I'm done being nice. And now revenge is the only thing that I have to live for, because in his mind, that is the like paradigm through which he views all of his moral decisions. And so he still thinks he's doing good things. It's just that this whole eye for an eye philosophy is what is now guiding him. So at that point, the character development becomes more internal because he has made that decision himself, and it was him reacting to circumstances. So yeah, I would say I definitely agree with that. And by the end of the book, even there's a further development where he starts to question some of his decision, and all of that is internal as well.
Yeah. Why do you think the character development is so satisfying, like from a reader's perspective?
I think it's satisfying because as he's experiencing these very intense emotions and situations and just all this crazy stuff is going down, you kind of experience the same things. Because when I first started reading it, I just kind of thought, yeah, this is a great adventure story. Like, I can't wait to see what happens next. And then I got into it and I'm like, I actually want this guy to get his revenge because he was a good person and he deserves it. And then halfway through, it's a little more than halfway through, things get a little bit out of hand, and his revenge, I don't want to like give away plot points, but his revenge goes a little bit farther than you would expect. And it kind of makes, as a reader, for a moment, it feels less satisfying. So it's like that, I think it's like at the end of the second act where you're like, I don't know actually if I like this anymore, and you don't know what you want to happen. So it feels satisfying at first, and then as you watch him, you start to wonder if that's actually what you wanted. And just any book that creates that level of conflict within the reader, I think ends up being satisfying once it's resolved, because that should be the goal of anything, is to any art or books in particular should be to create tension within the reader as well.
Yeah. So I may not be remembering this correctly because it's been a while since I've read the book. But if I am, is it at that point he's going too far with the revenge? And you're like, there's two. So it's like there's a difference between satisfying justice and just taking somebody out, like getting revenge, essentially. Yeah,
totally. There's a certain point where, without getting into like the specifics, so if you haven't read it and you were to read it in the future, you probably wouldn't see this coming. But the way he takes his revenge on people is kind of, he'll like plant seeds, so to speak. And then,
I remember that now.
Yeah. Okay, and then like people start making the choices he knows they're going to make. And then it turns out really badly. And at one point, like a bunch of people end up getting poisoned. And so it's like, oh, okay, maybe that wasn't what we necessarily wanted to happen. It starts to feel really serious, because up until then, it's just been like financial ruin and all these things that seem kind of deserved because he's dealing with greedy people.
Yeah. Okay, so I do remember that now. That kind of sparks something in my memory. I just had something I was going to say. I have this thing where just stuff drops out of my mind completely.
It's there and it's gone.
Do you have anything else to say about the Count of Monte Cristo?
I mean, just that I really liked it a lot more than I thought I would. When I first picked it up, I think just because it's so long, I thought it was going to be Moby Dick, and Moby Dick was really hard for me to get through. And it was one of those big books that I'm like, I should read this, but I don't want to because it's going to be boring. And it really didn't feel that way at all. It felt like I was watching Netflix. Like I just wanted to keep turning the pages. Like I have to get through the next season of The Count of Monte Cristo. It felt very exciting to me. And then once I finished it, all of these cool ideas about like when, like, is revenge good? Is it not? That kind of a thing. It just took me by surprise, I guess, is kind of my summation of that one.
Yeah, and if you're going to read The Count of Monte Cristo, there is a section in the middle that, from what I remember, there's stuff that happens, but it's a really slow burn, and it's like kind of like all the wind has stopped in the middle of the book, and you've got to get through that section, and then it starts again. So if you're going to read Count of Monte Cristo, just realize that.
Keep that in mind. There's this point where he's in prison for a long time, and then he gets out, and he basically travels the world learning about poisons and weapons and basically how to be a mastermind at getting revenge, I guess, but just how to be like a very crafty person. And during that time, there's just like 100 pages where he is barely even present in the book, and you're reading about other characters, and it's a little less exciting, but keep powering through because it definitely is worth it. And
yeah, I think part of the reason is because the author got paid by like the Word or something like that. He may have or something.
I don't know how exactly it worked, but
amazing.
I know it was like released as like a serial drama. So I think people kind of just ate it up like it was a soap opera, because like just a few chapters would keep coming out. And I was joking with my book club. I was like, yeah, that 100 pages was like when the writer's strike was going on, because it was not as creative. But
I just had some writer's block or something like that. But yeah, it is there. So be aware of that. So just get through those 100 pages and you'll be fine. Yep. So we've got Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, or my grandmother asked me to tell you I'm sorry. And part of me wants to skip Do Androids. Part of me wants to skip Androids because my grandmother asked me to tell you I'm sorry sounds really, really interesting, and I haven't read it, and I want to hear more about it, and it could take the rest of the podcast. I'm pretty sure it will.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, we can absolutely do that.
Yeah, let's jump to that then.
My grandmother asked me to tell you she's sorry, which is a mouthful of a title, but is by Frederick Bachman. Have you read anything by him?
I'm not sure.
His other stuff, he's actually a Swedish author, and I hadn't heard of him until recently, so I don't know how widely read he is. His most recent book, I think, is called Beartown, and then he wrote A Man Called Uva, which recently, or is going to be made into a movie. But he's contemporary. This one, My Grandmother Asked Me to Tell You She's Sorry, came out in 2013, and I think then it was translated in 2015. So it's pretty new. So it's a nice contrast to The Count of Monte Cristo, which is super old. But yeah, the basic premise of this one is it's about this little girl. She's between the ages of like 7 and 9, I'm guessing. I'm sure the book explains it, and I'm just not remembering her exact age. But she's kind of odd. She's a little bit too smart for her age. She doesn't really know she doesn't really think before she speaks, but she's also super smart, and she's just kind of quirky, and her best friend is her grandma. And what happens is, and she has trouble at school, like people tend to bully her, and her family is, there's like a little bit of tension there. She's just not super close with her parents, and at the beginning of the book, this is not a huge spoiler because it happens very quickly, her grandmother dies. And she's totally devastated by this because that was the only friend that she had in the world. And shortly thereafter, she discovers that her grandmother has left her this mission to go and apologize to a bunch of people that her grandmother had either, offended or done wrong to in some capacity in the past. So it's basically this adventure of this little girl going and meeting a bunch of new people with just crazy, interesting backgrounds and all kinds of life experience that she has never experienced before. And throughout that, she not only grows as a character, but she also gets to know her grandmother in a new capacity, and she ends up making a bunch of friends. So I thought it was very, very heartwarming, but yeah, heartwarming is not quite doing it justice, because it's beautifully written and it's very clever. It's just a good story, so I would highly recommend it.
Okay. And so you mentioned something that I think is really, really interesting. When you were just when we were communicating back and forth, you said that it's told from the little girl's perspective, but it's told from the little girl's perspective in a way that it's like seeing through her eyes.
Yeah.
So I want to hear more about that.
Yeah, so the whole story, it almost feels like magical realism, but it's not, because she's so young and she's so imaginative. She perceives the world in a way that is almost like a cartoon, like everything is exaggerated. So, for example, one of the people that her grandmother wants her to go, say I'm sorry to, is this guy who's a veteran who's dealing with just a lot of personal issues and all of the aftermath of his experiences at war and whatnot. And the little girl in the book, she like perceives him almost as this fantastical, like giant, like character. And so I don't think it's ever mentioned in the book explicitly, like, okay, this is a guy who's a veteran and he's probably dealing with some kind of PTSD or something like that. It's not mentioned that way. The reader just has to kind of gather that information. All they know is this girl sees this character who's kind of reclusive. She thinks he's like a reclusive, scary giant, and then she meets him and they become friends. So I think that's a really cool storytelling device, because it gives the author so much more freedom to explain the world in a way that they couldn't if they were explaining it from an adult perspective. Yeah.
And go on, sorry.
Oh no, I was just going to say another quote character that she meets, and it even took me like 20 pages to figure out what she was talking about. But there's this, I think she like describes it as like a monster or something like that. But someone is just keeping this really big dog in their apartment, and so she meets the dog, but it's not really stated that it's a dog. To her, it's just like this creature, and she befriends the dog as well and whatnot. So it's just that added layer of creativity, and just seeing it through a child's eyes is such a cool way to look at the world and also to tell a story.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. It's something that I've been going toward, like just thinking about a lot with writing and just art in general, because it's like, okay, there's a lot of different perspectives. It's likely like everybody has their own perspective and how they see something, and then it's just bringing a different perspective out. And not that like there isn't a monster or anything, but it's just how somebody sees something. And I think that's really interesting. For my, I don't know, it's such a long title. For my grandmother asked me to, it's a really long title. It's hard to say for me.
Oh no, me too. I say it wrong almost every single time. I'm like, my grandmother said, I'm sorry. Like, I don't know. I just call it my grandmother, we'll say.
my grandmother. So in that, so like, what's like the central thing is that the central thing that makes this like a unique story, or is there more to it that does?
I think that's the primary thing that makes it unique, but that's also me looking at it as someone who is interested in writing. So the actual, like, the book, like those things happen in the book, but what the book is about, I would say is it's about love, and it's about friendship, and it's about forgiveness. So, those are the major themes that tend to crop up, because as this little girl is going and talking to people who have some connection to her grandmother, she's starting to understand, she's starting to sympathize with them, for one thing. And I think that's a new experience for her, because she's just kind of she's a kid, first of all, but she's also kind of a weird kid. So she's starting to understand people's backgrounds and how that shapes them. And then also she's starting to understand her grandmother, because she idolized her grandmother so much until the point that she died, that her grandmother could do no wrong. Even the girl's mom and her have kind of a strained relationship, just because the girl tends to get in trouble with her grandmother all the time and whatnot. So once the grandmother dies, and then the little girl's going out and meeting these people that the grandmother wants to apologize to, after she has died, then the girl starts to realize that even her grandmother wasn't perfect. And so it's this whole, it's almost a coming of age story, except that the character is a little bit too young to be coming of age, but it is her even coming into a new perspective of the world and just understanding what makes people who they are. So I think that's kind of the theme, you know, what the book is about, if you're just reading it and not necessarily analyzing it.
Yeah. And not looking at it from a writing perspective.
Yeah, totally.
But at the same time, you can't really, it wouldn't be the same book if it didn't approach writing in that way. Yeah. I think go on.
I think if he had written it just, it's written, I think it's in the third person, but it's like clearly through her eyes. But if he had just written it more objectively, like third person omniscient, it would have completely flopped for me, because you wouldn't have had that depth that her, you know, her just like the cute way of looking at the world brought into it. And also her misconceptions about people and stuff. Because at the beginning of the book, she's extremely judgmental. It talks about how she'll pass judgments on people by what they like to read and stuff like that. So she has all of these funny little idiosyncrasies and ideas about how the world works. And then her kind of coming into this understanding that everyone has a past and that shapes them. And also her grandmother had a past that she didn't understand and that shaped her and their relationship. Like, that could not be there if he had taken more of an omniscient, objective perspective and just told us what happened.
Yeah. And you really get I haven't read the book, but I would assume you really get the experience of the kid. Like, you're able to see through her eyes a lot more than if he was just had an omniscient perspective. Like, you're actually, like, I guess you can still do that. You can still make it so that you're able to, but I think that it's just different.
Yeah, totally. Like, there are even certain scenes where it's just like the family in their house and whatnot. And the way that things are described, it casts kind of a negative light on the parents and whatnot. And at first I'm like, well, the parents, I don't like them very much. But in reality, we're talking about like an 8-year-old who just doesn't like their parents, you know, which is like, she's just being, you know, she might just be being a brat about something, you know. So that kind of a thing, it kind of tricks you into assuming her perspective, which is, I think, is really cool.
Yeah, I think that's really cool too. I think that to a certain degree, like, writing itself is like that. Well, and I think any type of art is like that. So, like, I'll explain. Maybe it's not super clear. So you have an experience and you're trying to get someone else to experience the thing. That's kind of what I'm saying. I've just been doing a lot of thinking about, this is going back to what I was talking about before, and I didn't want to go on a tangent, but I can't help it. Like, you have an experience of something and you're like, wow, I don't know, whatever the experience is, and you're trying to take that experience, you're trying to put it into something, like either whether it's written word or music or just a painting, and you're trying to, when somebody looks at it, have them go through that experience again.
Yeah, totally. It's like, sorry, go ahead.
No, go. Yeah.
No, I was going to say, like, especially as a writer, when a writer has to assume a character in order to create a story. And then you also have to convince your audience to assume that character. And I think,
yeah,
definitely.
Yeah,
I think this book does it well.
Yeah, that's another thing. Like, you're actually making your audience, like, go through the thoughts of the character, not the actions of the character, of course, but like, rethink the things. But yeah, I think, have you run into any other books that have done, like, taken something like that? So they're written third person, but they're from the perspective, like, what the character sees. How many books have you run into like that?
Off the top of my head, let me think. I'm not going to remember if they're third person. This one stuck out me the most, but as far as now I'm not going to remember off the top of my head.
That's all right.
Of a full list of them, but this was just something I noticed with this one. I think because she's a child, it really stuck out to me.
Yeah.
But I think to a certain extent, any book you read and relate to is going to do that. Yeah. Let me pull up. This is totally cheating, but I'm going to pull up my Goodreads and just scan through like the last 10 books I read and see if any of them ring a bell.
Yeah. No, I just I'm sorry, I'm kind of stuck on this because I think it's so cool. I think it's super cool when authors do that, or they take the perspective of someone other than themselves and they try to put themselves in the shoes of that person, and make like, and they're not like, you don't tell, like, I like it when authors don't tell me everything that's going on. They just tell me what a character sees, because it's more, it's a video game term, but it's more immersive to me, at least.
Yeah.
So that's what I find it to be. And I find it so much more satisfying because, for whatever reason, like maybe it's because you get sick of your own experiences, like it gets mundane, and then suddenly the new experience is brought, you read it and you get to experience a new experience from a different perspective you've never been able to before.
Yeah,
so.
Actually, I'm looking through, I think 100%, like that is, yeah. And it's not just books, but books are like a pretty easy example of it because it is written. But, and it's what I understand the most. Like, I'm not a composer, so I couldn't tell you how to do that with music. But with books, I can identify it much more. But another example, I have a couple off the top of my head, and one of them is actually a collection of short stories, or a couple collections of short stories, and that would be Interpreter of Maladies by Jhumpa Lahiri. And she actually won the Pulitzer Prize for her first collection of short stories, which is how I got into reading her stuff. Yeah, which I'm like, okay, clearly she's good because she won this, so I should read it. And I did. And it's funny because her family, I hope I'm not going to get the information right, but basically she grew up in the United States, but her parents are originally from India. So it's this very, she has like a very mixed cultural background. Like she has experienced both fully. So when she writes these short stories, most of her characters are either new to the United States or they're like the children of people who came. So they're like first or second generation families living here, and their experiences, like that's not something that I personally can relate to, but she tells it in such a way that I feel like I am feeling everything that those characters are feeling. And it's like a foreign thing to me because I grew up here and I haven't lived in any other countries, but the way that she puts these characters out there is just like you start to understand the cultural implications of how life works for them, living in New York opposed to living where they grew up or where their parents grew up. And I don't even know how she does it. She just does it beautifully. So it's more of a recommendation than me being able to explain it, but that would be a good one off the top of my head, especially for short stories, because short stories, you have even less time to do that. And she does a fantastic job of doing that. Yeah,
I find short stories very difficult to write because I don't know. You have to think about it differently. So we won't have time for androids. We'll just shorten up the name because it's too long anyways. Everything should be 2 words. Everything should be 2 or 3 words, and that's
just
it. Just
1-word titles all the time. Just hashtags.
Unless it just rolls off your tongue. Then that's all right. Hashtags, because we can't concentrate on anything now anymore, which is all right.
Hashtag androids.
That's fine. All right, so we don't have time for that, but is there anything you'd like to say just about creativity, writing, or anything like that before it's time to be done?
Gosh, that's a big question. I would say, I don't know. I think that my takeaway, even when I think about books like in groups, like, we were just talked about 2 different books and they're 2 extremely different books. However, they both have something really unique to offer. So as a writer, when you are looking at literature and you're reading things, even just for fun, even if it's something, that you're just reading just for kicks, like on vacation, think about things from that perspective, and also understand that as a writer, everyone has that ability. And so the ability to identify it in other books is extremely important. And that's the first step to actually creating art or creating literature or stories or anything that communicates to people. And I think writing is just so cool because it is one of the most direct forms of communication, but it's also one of the most freeing forms of communication because you can invent anything, between the covers of a book. So that's kind of my takeaway, especially looking at 2 very different stories, just understanding how, anything can really fuel that level of creativity and that ability to communicate to your audience.
Yeah, that's a really good thought. I like it. So if you want to check out her stuff, again, it's Emily Brady at plotboilers.com. So it's plot as in plot of a story, boilers.com. Emily, thank you for being on the show.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
All right, that is all we've got for you this week. As always, my name is Daniel Poppy, and this is How to Write Good.